The morning of October 12, 2008, dawned crisp and golden over Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, a picturesque town nestled in the rolling hills where the Cumberland Mountains began their gentle rise toward Kentucky. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to worship at various congregations throughout the valley. At Cornerstone Baptist Church, a modest but well-maintained brick building that had served the community for over 70 years, Pastor Benjamin Theodore Ashworth was preparing for what would become the most important, and final, sermon of his ministry. At 30 years old, Ben possessed an earnest face marked by kind brown eyes and prematurely gray temples that gave him an air of wisdom beyond his years. His gentle demeanor and passionate preaching had endeared him to the 400-member congregation he had served faithfully for the past 8 years. "Ben, honey, you've been pacing for the last hour," called his wife, Catherine Louise Ashworth, from the kitchen of their modest parsonage next to the church. Kate, as everyone called her, was 28 years old with auburn hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that sparkled with warmth and intelligence. She was beloved by the congregation not only for her sweet soprano voice that led the church choir, but for her genuine care for every member of their church family. I know," Ben replied, running his hands through his hair as he stood in his study, surrounded by theological books and sermon notes scattered across his oak desk. "It's just that Mr. Harrison Blackstone is coming today." The Harrison Blackstone 3. "Kate, do you understand what this could mean for our church? For our community?" Kate smiled as she flipped pancakes on the griddle, the familiar sounds of their Sunday morning routine providing comfort despite her husband's obvious nervousness. "I understand that he's a man who needs to hear about Jesus, just like everyone else who walks through our doors." From the living room came the excited chatter of their 2 children. Timothy James, 8 years old with his father's earnest brown eyes and his mother's quick wit, was helping his 5-year-old sister Sarah Grace with a jigsaw puzzle featuring Noah's Ark. Sarah, a petite girl with blonde curls and an infectious giggle, was known throughout the church for her habit of giving wildly enthusiastic hugs to anyone within reach. "Daddy!" Sarah called out, running into the study and wrapping her small arms around Ben's legs. "Mommy made your favorite pancakes, and Tommy helped." "I did help," Timothy confirmed proudly, appearing in the doorway. "I measured the flour all by myself, and I only spilled a little bit." Ben's anxiety melted away as he scooped Sarah into his arms and ruffled Timothy's hair. These moments with his family grounded him, reminding him that regardless of prominent visitors or church politics, his primary calling was to love God and love his family well. The Ashworth family had moved to Willowbrook Springs 8 years earlier when Ben accepted the call to pastor Cornerstone Baptist Church. They had fallen in love with the small-town charm, the genuine faith of the congregation, and the sense that God had called them to this specific place for this specific ministry. Their modest salary was supplemented by Kate's part-time work as a piano teacher, and they lived simply but contentedly in the church-provided parsonage. "Ben," Kate called from the kitchen, "breakfast is ready. And remember, whatever happens with Mr. Blackstone today, God has already prepared your heart and your words." As the family gathered around their small dining table for breakfast, Ben led them in prayer. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, for our family, and for the opportunity to serve you at Cornerstone Baptist Church. We ask for your wisdom as we meet with our visitor today, and we pray that your will would be done in all things. Help us to love others as you have loved us. In Jesus' name, Amen." "Amen." Sarah echoed enthusiastically, immediately reaching for the syrup with both hands. The morning service proceeded normally, with Kate leading the congregation in several beloved hymns while Ben felt his nervousness return as he scanned the sanctuary for any sign of Harrison Blackstone 3. The millionaire industrialist was known throughout Tennessee for his vast business empire that included everything from coal mining operations to high-end resort developments. More importantly for Ben, Blackstone was rumored to be considering a significant charitable donation to a worthy religious organization, and somehow Cornerstone Baptist Church had made his shortlist. At precisely 10:47 a.m., just as Ben was beginning his sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan, the sanctuary's heavy oak doors opened to admit a tall, impeccably dressed man in his mid-50s. Harrison Blackstone III commanded attention without saying a word. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit was clearly custom-tailored, and his steel-gray eyes surveyed the simple church interior with an expression that suggested he was accustomed to much grander surroundings. Ben continued his sermon, but he couldn't help noticing how Blackstone's presence seemed to alter the atmosphere in the sanctuary. Several congregation members turned to stare at the famous visitor, and Ben felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. This sermon needed to be perfect. This entire service needed to demonstrate why Cornerstone Baptist Church deserved Blackstone's consideration. The Good Samaritan didn't help his neighbor because he expected recognition or reward, Ben preached, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. He helped because love compels us to action. True faith isn't about what we can gain, but about what we can give. After the service, Blackstone approached Ben with a firm handshake and a businessman's practiced smile. "Pastor Ashworth, thank you for a thought-provoking message. I wonder if we might have a private conversation this afternoon. I have a proposition that could be quite beneficial for your church." Ben's heart raced with excitement and trepidation. "Of course, Mr. Blackstone. Would 2 o'clock work for you? We could meet in my study at the parsonage." "Perfect. I'll see you then." Blackstone's smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he turned and walked away, leaving Ben with a strange mixture of hope and unease. Kate approached her husband as the congregation filed out of the sanctuary, many members whispering excitedly about the famous visitor. "How do you feel about this meeting, Ben?" "Honestly, I'm not sure. There's something about him that makes me uncomfortable, but I can't put my finger on what it is. Maybe I'm just nervous about the potential opportunity." "Trust your instincts," Kate advised, linking her arm through his. "And remember that we've been blessed here in Willowbrook Springs regardless of any outside funding. God has provided for us faithfully." That afternoon, Harrison Blackstone III arrived at the parsonage precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed a family for months. Ben led him into his modest study, offering coffee that Blackstone politely declined. "Pastor Ashworth," Blackstone began, settling into the worn armchair across from Ben's desk, "I'll be direct. I'm considering a substantial donation to your church, enough to build a new sanctuary, expand your children's ministries, and establish an endowment for future needs. We're talking about a life-changing amount of money." Ben's mouth went dry. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Blackstone. What would be required of us?" Blackstone's smile became sharper. "Ah, the right question. I appreciate directness." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick contract. "My donation would come with certain expectations. I would need assurance that Cornerstone Baptist Church would support specific political candidates and causes that align with my business interests. Nothing too dramatic, just a pulpit endorsement here and there, perhaps hosting some fundraising events." Ben felt his stomach sink as he scanned the contract pages. "Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate your generosity, but I'm not sure this is something our congregation would be comfortable with. We've always maintained that our pulpit should be reserved for God's word, not political endorsements." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blackstone's jovial businessman facade slipped, revealing something colder underneath. "Pastor Ashworth, I think you misunderstand the magnitude of this opportunity. This donation would transform not just your church, but your entire community. Surely a man of God would want to provide the best possible future for his congregation." "Of course I want what's best for our church," Ben replied carefully, "but I also believe that compromising our principles would ultimately harm rather than help our ministry." Blackstone leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes boring into Ben's. "Let me be clearer. I've made this same offer to 3 other churches in this region. 2 have already accepted. The third—" He paused meaningfully. "Well, let's just say that Pastor Williams of Mount Zion Methodist discovered that declining my offer came with unfortunate consequences. Financial audits, property disputes, mysterious complaints to denominational headquarters. It's amazing how quickly a pastor's reputation can be destroyed when the wrong people start asking the wrong questions. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackstone? Threatening? Goodness, no. Blackstone's smile returned, but it held no warmth. I'm simply explaining reality. You have something I need, a respected voice in this community. I have something you need, the resources to fulfill your ministry dreams. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement. And if I refuse? Blackstone stood slowly, closing his briefcase with deliberate precision. Pastor Ashworth, I've built a multi-million-dollar empire by understanding how the world really works. People who work with me prosper. People who oppose me, don't. I'll give you 48 hours to reconsider. Think about your beautiful wife, your precious children. Think about the security this partnership could provide for them. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke as Blackstone showed himself out, leaving Ben alone in his study with a racing heart and sweating palms. Through the window, he watched the millionaire climb into a black Mercedes and drive away, leaving behind an atmosphere of menace that seemed to linger long after his departure. That evening, Ben shared the details of the meeting with Kate as they sat on their front porch swing, watching Timothy and Sarah play in the yard under the golden glow of the setting sun. What are you going to do? Kate asked, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. I'm going to pray, Ben replied, taking her hand. And then I'm going to tell him no. We can't compromise our integrity, no matter what he threatens. Kate squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you, Ben. And I'm with you, whatever happens. 2 days later, on Tuesday, October 14th, Ben called Harrison Blackstone's office to deliver his decision. The conversation was brief and ominous. Mr. Blackstone, I've made my decision. Cornerstone Baptist Church must respectfully decline your generous offer. There was a long pause before Blackstone's voice came through the phone, cold and measured. I see. That's disappointing, Pastor Ashworth. I hope you won't come to regret this decision. I won't, Ben replied with more confidence than he felt. We'll see, Blackstone said softly, and the line went dead. The rest of that Tuesday passed normally. Ben spent the afternoon visiting elderly congregation members at Willowbrook Springs Care Center, while Kate taught piano lessons to local children. Timothy and Sarah attended the church's after-school program, where they worked on crafts and played games with other children from the congregation. The family reunited for dinner at 6 o'clock, sharing stories from their day over Kate's homemade meatloaf and mashed potatoes. After dinner, they held their customary family devotions in the living room, reading from the Book of Psalms and praying together. Dear Jesus, Sarah prayed in her sweet 5-year-old voice, thank you for our family and our church and for all the people who love us. Help Daddy's sermon be really good on Sunday, and help Tommy not to be scared of the dark anymore. Amen. I'm not scared of the dark. Timothy protested, though he had indeed been having nightmares recently. It's okay to be scared sometimes, Ben assured his son. Even grown-ups get scared. The important thing is to remember that God is always with us, even in the dark. The family was settling into their bedtime routine when the doorbell rang at 9:30 p.m. Ben and Kate exchanged glances. Unexpected visitors at this hour were unusual in Willowbrook Springs. Ben opened the front door to find 2 men in dark suits standing on his porch. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of alert, professional demeanor that immediately put Ben on edge. Pastor Ashworth, the first man said politely. My name is Marcus Webb, and this is my associate, David Chin. We work for Mr. Harrison Blackstone. He'd like to have another conversation with you this evening. It's rather late, Ben replied cautiously. Perhaps we could schedule something for tomorrow? I'm afraid Mr. Blackstone is leaving town tonight, Webb said smoothly. This really is your last opportunity to reconsider his offer. Ben felt Kate appear beside him, her hand finding his arm. Something about these men's presence felt wrong, predatory. I'll need to discuss this with my wife, Ben said. Of course. We'll wait in our car while you talk it over. The men retreated to a black SUV parked in the driveway, but Ben noticed they positioned themselves where they could watch both the front and back doors of the parsonage. "Ben, I don't like this," Kate whispered as they huddled in the hallway. "Something feels very wrong." "I know. But maybe if I go with them and have this final conversation, Blackstone will accept my decision and leave us alone." "Don't go," Kate pleaded. "We should call the police." "And tell them what?" "That some businessmen want to have a meeting." "Kate, if I don't handle this properly, things could get much worse for our family." After a tense discussion, Ben made the decision that would haunt Kate for the next 15 years. "I'm going to go with them. I'll have this conversation with Blackstone, make it clear that our answer is final, and hopefully that will be the end of it." "Then we're all going," Kate said firmly. "I'm not letting you face this alone, and I'm not staying here with the children if these men know where we live." "Kate, that's not." "Ben, we're a family. We face things together." Against his better judgment, Ben agreed. They quickly packed an overnight bag with some clothes and important documents, roused Timothy and Sarah from their beds, and walked out to the waiting SUV. The children were sleepy and confused but excited about what they thought was an unexpected adventure. Marcus Webb helped load their bags while David Chen held the vehicle's doors open with professional courtesy that felt somehow menacing. "Mr. Blackstone is waiting at his private estate about an hour from here," Webb explained as they settled into the luxury vehicle. "He's prepared guest accommodations for your family." As the SUV pulled away from the parsonage, Ben looked back at Cornerstone Baptist Church illuminated by streetlights in the darkness. Something deep in his spirit told him this was wrong, but he had committed now. He reached for Kate's hand and felt her trembling slightly. "Where we going, Daddy?" Sarah asked sleepily from her position curled against Kate's side. "To meet the man from church, sweetheart. The one who visited on Sunday." "Oh," Sarah said, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and promptly fell back asleep. Timothy, however, was wide awake and studying their escorts with the sharp eyes of an intelligent 8-year-old. "Daddy," he whispered, "I don't think these are good men." "Shoo," Ben whispered back, but privately he agreed with his son's assessment. The drive stretched longer than the promised hour, winding through increasingly remote countryside where the lights of civilization grew sparse and eventually disappeared altogether. Ben's anxiety grew with each passing mile, but he forced himself to remain calm for his family's sake. Finally, they turned through imposing iron gates and drove up a long driveway toward a massive stone mansion that loomed against the night sky like something from a Gothic novel. Security lights illuminated manicured grounds and revealed several other black vehicles parked near the entrance. "Impressive, isn't it?" Webb commented as they pulled up to the front entrance. "Mr. Blackstone's great-grandfather built this estate in the 1890s. It's been in the family ever since." The mansion's interior was as imposing as its exterior, with soaring ceilings, expensive artwork, and furnishings that spoke of old money and established power. Harrison Blackstone waited in a library that could have housed Cornerstone Baptist Church's entire congregation, flanked by floor-to-ceiling bookcases and dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Pastor Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth, Blackstone greeted them with apparent warmth, though his smile still didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize for the late hour, but as I mentioned, I'm leaving town tonight. I wanted one final opportunity to discuss our potential partnership." Sarah had awakened during the walk from the car and now hid behind Kate's legs, apparently intimidated by the mansion's grandeur and their host's imposing presence. Timothy stayed close to Ben's side, his young face serious and alert. "Mr. Blackstone," Ben began, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, but our position hasn't changed. We cannot accept your offer as it was presented." Blackstone's expression darkened. "I see. That's unfortunate, Pastor Ashworth. Truly unfortunate." He gestured to several men who had been standing quietly in the shadows of the library. "I had hoped we could reach an understanding." "Daddy?" Sarah whispered, sensing the tension in the room. "It's okay, sweetheart," Ben said, though he was beginning to realize that nothing about this situation was okay. Actually, Pastor Ashworth, I'm afraid it's not okay, Blackstone said, his veneer of politeness finally dropping completely. You see, I've invested considerable time and resources in this project. I've made promises to certain political allies who are expecting your cooperation. Your refusal to participate creates complications. Kate stepped closer to Ben, instinctively gathering their children. What are you saying, Mr. Blackstone? I'm saying, Mrs. Ashworth, that your family has become a liability. But don't worry, I've found a solution that will benefit everyone involved. The men in the shadows stepped forward, and Ben realized with growing horror that they were armed. You're making a mistake, Blackstone. We're not criminals. We're just a family trying to serve God faithfully. Indeed you are, Blackstone agreed. And that's exactly why you're so valuable to me. The problem is, you're valuable whether you cooperate willingly or not. What do you mean? Kate demanded, her voice rising with fear and anger. Blackstone walked to an ornate desk and picked up a folder thick with documents. Mrs. Ashworth, your husband's reputation in Willowbrook Springs is impeccable. People trust him, respect him, follow his guidance. That influence is worth millions to the right buyer. He opened the folder and began laying out photographs and documents on the desk. These are financial records showing that Pastor Ashworth has been embezzling church funds for years. These photographs show him meeting with known criminals. These witness statements describe his involvement in various illegal activities. Ben stared at the fabricated evidence in shock. Those are forgeries. Lies. Of course they are, Blackstone said cheerfully. But they're very convincing forgeries. Professional grade. The kind that would hold up in court, destroy your reputation, and send you to prison for a very long time. Kate was shaking with rage now. You can't do this. People who know Ben would never believe those lies. Wouldn't they? Blackstone smiled coldly. People believe what they're told to believe, especially when the evidence is presented by authoritative sources. A financial audit here, an FBI investigation there, some strategic leaks to the media. It's amazing how quickly a respected pastor can become a pariah. Timothy, despite his young age, seemed to understand that something terrible was happening. He moved closer to his father and whispered, "Daddy, let's go home." "I wish we could, son," Ben said softly, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this nightmare. Blackstone continued his explanation with the casual tone of a businessman discussing quarterly reports. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to disappear, Pastor Ashworth. All of you. But don't worry, you're not going to be harmed. You're going to be relocated to a place where you can live quietly and comfortably, while I use your reputation and identity to further my political interests." "You're insane," Kate said flatly. "I'm practical," Blackstone corrected. "I need Pastor Benjamin Ashworth's voice endorsing my chosen candidates and causes. The real Pastor Ashworth has proved uncooperative, so I'll simply arrange for a more amenable replacement to take his place." Ben felt the world spinning around him as the full magnitude of Blackstone's plan became clear. "You're going to replace me? With who?" "With someone who understands the value of cooperation. Don't worry about the details, Pastor. Your replacement will be thoroughly trained to impersonate you convincingly. Similar height, build, voice coaching, extensive study of your background and mannerisms. The congregation of Cornerstone Baptist Church will never know the difference." "But people will know," Kate protested desperately. "His family, close friends. Will be told that Pastor Ashworth and his family died tragically in a car accident while traveling to a denominational conference," Blackstone finished smoothly. "Very sad. Very convincing. Bodies too damaged for open casket viewing, of course. The community will mourn appropriately, and then they'll welcome the new pastor who happens to look remarkably like their beloved Benjamin Ashworth." Sarah began crying, sensing her parents' distress even if she didn't understand the conversation. Kate gathered her daughter into her arms while Timothy pressed closer to Ben's side. "You'll never get away with this," Ben said, but even as he spoke the words, he realized how carefully Blackstone had planned this operation. "Actually, I will," Blackstone replied confidently. "I've successfully managed similar operations before. Pastor Williams from Mount Zion Methodist, for instance. He and his family are living very comfortably in a secure location in South America. He initially resisted the arrangement, but he's quite content now. His replacement has been endorsing my preferred political candidates for 2 years." Ben felt Kate's hand find his, her touch grounding him even as their world collapsed around them. He closed his eyes and whispered a desperate prayer, "God, help us. Protect our children. If this is how our story ends, please let your will be done." "Touching," Blackstone commented dryly. "Now, let's discuss your new living arrangements." 15 years passed in Willowbrook Springs with the memory of the Ashworth family hanging over the community like a shadow that never quite lifted. The official story, that Pastor Benjamin Ashworth, his wife Catherine, and their 2 children had died in a tragic car accident while driving to a denominational conference in Nashville, had been accepted by most of the congregation, though a persistent minority continued to ask uncomfortable questions. The accident report had been thorough and convincing: a single-car crash on a rainy night, the vehicle careening off a winding mountain road and exploding on impact. Bodies burned beyond recognition, dental records somehow lost in a clerical error, closed casket memorial service attended by hundreds of grieving community members. The new pastor who had arrived 6 months later bore a striking resemblance to Benjamin Ashworth and claimed to be a distant cousin who felt called to continue Ben's ministry at Cornerstone Baptist Church. But Margaret Elizabeth Thornton had never believed the official story. At 67 years old, Margaret was a retired librarian who had served as Cornerstone Baptist Church's volunteer historian for over 30 years. She had known Benjamin Ashworth better than most, had worked closely with him on documenting the church's archives, had spent countless hours in conversation with him about theology and church history, had watched him interact with his family during informal church gatherings. The man who had replaced Ben might look similar and sound similar, but Margaret's sharp eyes and sharper memory detected subtle differences that troubled her deeply. "There's something wrong with Pastor Ashworth," she had confided to her closest friend, Eleanor Rose Whitman, shortly after the new pastor's arrival. "He doesn't remember conversations we had. He doesn't know which books were his favorites in the church library. He called Timothy, Tommy, last Sunday, but Ben never used that nickname." Eleanor, a practical woman who preferred to avoid controversy, had tried to discourage Margaret's suspicions. "People change when they've experienced trauma, Margaret. Grief affects memory. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there." But Margaret Thornton had built her life around careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. Her personal journals from the period immediately following the Ashworth family's disappearance documented dozens of small discrepancies that collectively painted a disturbing picture. November 15, 2008, Pastor Ashworth preached about David and Goliath today, but he misquoted Benjamin's favorite verse from that story. The real Ben always emphasized verse 47 about the battle belonging to the Lord. This man quoted verse 45 instead. December 3, 2008, watched Pastor Ashworth blessing the communion elements today. His hands moved differently. Benjamin always made the sign of the cross over the bread before breaking it, a habit from his Episcopal childhood that he never lost. This man didn't. January 18, 2009, asked Pastor Ashworth about the historical research project he and I were working on before his family's accident. He had no memory of our discussion about the church's founding documents. Benjamin was passionate about that project. This man seemed confused and quickly changed the subject. Margaret's suspicions might have remained private concerns if not for the discovery she made in the spring of 2009. While reorganizing the church's historical archives, she found a box of Benjamin Ashworth's personal papers that had somehow been missed during the hasty clearing of his study after the reported accident. Among the papers was Ben's private journal from October 2008, with entries that made Margaret's blood run cold. October 10, 2008, met with Harrison Blackstone today. Something about him troubles me deeply. His offer seems too good to be true, and the conditions he's attaching feel like compromises our church should never make. October 12, 2008, Blackstone's visit to the service today confirmed my worst fears. This man radiates a darkness that has nothing to do with the gospel. Kate agrees. She said his presence made her skin crawl. October 13, 2008, told Blackstone no. He didn't take it well. Made veiled threats about what happens to pastors who don't cooperate with his plans. I'm praying for wisdom and protection. October 14, 2008, called Blackstone's office and gave him my final answer. His response was chilling, "We'll see. I have a terrible feeling that this isn't over. Lord, protect my family." The journal entries ended there, but they provided the first concrete evidence that something sinister had happened to the real Benjamin Ashworth and his family. Margaret carefully photocopied the relevant pages and began her own investigation, driven by a determination to uncover the truth that had been buried for nearly a year. Her first step was researching Harrison Blackstone III, a task that proved both enlightening and terrifying. Blackstone's business empire was vast and shadowy, with connections to mining operations, real estate development, and political lobbying groups throughout the southeastern United States. More disturbing were the patterns Margaret uncovered when she cross-referenced Blackstone's activities with mysterious disappearances of other religious leaders who had opposed his political agenda. Pastor Robert Williams of Mount Zion Methodist Church had reportedly died in a skiing accident in Colorado in 2006, shortly after refusing to endorse Blackstone's chosen candidate for state senator. Reverend Michael Rodriguez of St. Augustine Catholic Church had allegedly suffered a heart attack while hiking alone in 2007, just weeks after preaching a sermon condemning political corruption. Father James McKinney of Sacred Heart Episcopal Church had supposedly been killed in a mugging while visiting family in Detroit in 2008, less than a month after publicly opposing a Blackstone-funded development project. Each case followed a similar pattern. A religious leader who opposed Blackstone's interests died under circumstances that were tragic but not obviously suspicious, and each was subsequently replaced by a new pastor who proved remarkably supportive of Blackstone's political agenda. Margaret documented her findings meticulously, but she quickly realized that she was dealing with forces far more powerful and dangerous than anything she could handle alone. Her attempts to interest local law enforcement in her theories were met with polite dismissal. The car accident had been thoroughly investigated, they explained, and there was no evidence of foul play. Mrs. Thornton, Detective Samuel Harrison Beck told her during one of several fruitless meetings at the Willowbrook Springs Police Department, "I understand your concerns, but we can't reopen a closed case based on speculation. You're suggesting an incredibly complex conspiracy involving multiple murders and identity theft. That's the stuff of thriller novels, not real life." "But the evidence," Margaret began. "The evidence you've shown me consists of journal entries expressing concerns about a business meeting and your personal observations about behavioral changes that could easily be explained by trauma and grief," Detective Beck interrupted gently. "I'm not trying to dismiss your concerns, ma'am, but we have to deal in facts, not theories." Frustrated but undeterred, Margaret expanded her investigation beyond official channels. She began corresponding with family members and friends of the other disappeared pastors, sharing her findings and gradually building a network of people who shared her suspicions about Harrison Blackstone's activities. In 2010, Margaret connected with Dr. Patricia N. Sinclair, a forensic anthropologist and former FBI consultant who had taken early retirement after becoming disillusioned with federal politics. Dr. Sinclair was living quietly in Asheville, North Carolina, but she agreed to review Margaret's research after being contacted through a mutual friend. "What you've uncovered is deeply troubling," Dr. Sinclair told Margaret during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop in Johnson City, Tennessee. "The patterns you've identified are consistent with the activities of an organized criminal enterprise with significant resources and political protection. Can you help me prove it?" Margaret asked hopefully. Dr. Sinclair shook her head sadly. "Not through official channels. Blackstone has too many connections in law enforcement and politics. But there might be another way. If your theory is correct, and these men have been replaced by imposters, there will be physical evidence somewhere. Bodies, personal effects, documentation of the replacement process. Criminals always make mistakes, especially over time. Where would we look for such evidence? Somewhere Blackstone controls completely. His estate, his business properties, maybe even properties connected to his operations that appear unrelated on the surface. Dr. Sinclair leaned forward intently. Mrs. Thornton, what you're contemplating is dangerous. These people have killed to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. Margaret felt a chill of fear, but her determination remained unshaken. Dr. Sinclair, if I'm right, then dozens of families have been destroyed, and entire communities have been deceived. I can't just walk away from that. Over the next several years, Margaret and Dr. Sinclair worked together to map Blackstone's network of properties and associates, looking for locations where evidence might be hidden. They discovered that Blackstone owned numerous remote properties throughout Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina, including several that had been purchased through shell companies and appeared to have no obvious business purpose. In 2015, their investigation received an unexpected boost when Margaret was contacted by Thomas Richard Pemberton, a former security contractor who had worked for Blackstone in the early 2000s. Pemberton, now living under an assumed name in Oregon, had followed news coverage of Margaret's theories through internet forums dedicated to missing persons cases. I can't prove what Blackstone is doing, Pemberton told Margaret during a secure phone conversation, but I can tell you that he's capable of exactly what you're suggesting. I worked on several special projects for him that involved making people disappear without leaving traces. I thought I was helping with witness protection, but I started to realize that some of these people hadn't volunteered for protection. Pemberton's testimony provided crucial insights into Blackstone's methods, but it also confirmed Margaret's worst fears about the scope of the operation. According to Pemberton, Blackstone had been replacing influential religious leaders throughout the southeastern United States for at least a decade, building a network of compliant pastors who could influence their congregation's political behavior. The operation was incredibly sophisticated, Pemberton explained. They would study a target for months, gathering detailed information about his personal history, mannerisms, relationships, even his theological positions. Then they would recruit and train a replacement who could pass for the original, at least for casual interactions. What happened to the real pastors and their families? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. That varied depending on the situation. Sometimes they were relocated to secure facilities in South America where they could live comfortably but never return home. Sometimes. Pemberton's voice trailed off meaningfully. Sometimes they were killed, Margaret finished. I never had direct knowledge of murders, Pemberton said carefully, but people who asked too many questions had a tendency to suffer unfortunate accidents. Armed with Pemberton's information, Margaret and Dr. Sinclair focused their attention on a specific property that Pemberton had identified as one of Blackstone's primary operational sites, a remote compound in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, officially owned by Pinnacle Security Solutions but actually controlled by Blackstone through a web of shell companies. If physical evidence exists, Dr. Sinclair told Margaret, it would be at that facility. But getting access would require law enforcement cooperation, and we've already established that local authorities aren't interested in pursuing this case. Then we'll have to find another way, Margaret replied with grim determination. By 2018, 10 years after the Ashworth family's disappearance, Margaret's investigation had reached a stalemate. She had accumulated substantial circumstantial evidence suggesting that Benjamin Ashworth and his family had been murdered and replaced by imposters, but she lacked the kind of concrete proof that would convince skeptical authorities to reopen the case. The false pastor Ashworth continued his ministry at Cornerstone Baptist Church, and his political endorsements had indeed helped elect several candidates favorable to Blackstone's business interests. The congregation seemed content with their pastor, though a few longtime members occasionally mentioned that he seemed different somehow since his family's tragic accident. Margaret, now 77 years old and struggling with health problems, began to despair that justice would never be served for the Ashworth family. She had devoted a decade of her life to uncovering the truth, but the forces she was fighting seemed too powerful and well protected to defeat. In her final journal entry from this period, she wrote, "I fear I am too old and too tired to continue this fight much longer. If I cannot expose the truth about what happened to Benjamin, Catherine, Timothy, and Sarah Ashworth, perhaps someone younger and stronger will pick up where I left off. The evidence is documented. The patterns are clear. Someday, somehow, the truth will come to light. God does not let evil triumph forever. But Margaret Thornton's decade-long investigation was about to bear unexpected fruit, thanks to a renovation project at Cornerstone Baptist Church that would finally reveal the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years. The renovation of Cornerstone Baptist Church began in earnest during the spring of 2023, 15 years after the Ashworth family's disappearance. The project had been long overdue, the building's aging infrastructure needed significant updates, and the growing congregation required expanded facilities. More importantly for Margaret Thornton, now 82 and confined to a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, the renovation provided the first opportunity in decades to access areas of the church that had been sealed off or forgotten. Christopher Daniel Ashford, the lead contractor for Morrison and Associates Construction, was a man in his early 40s with sandy brown hair and thoughtful blue eyes that reminded several longtime church members of someone they couldn't quite place. Chris had grown up in Willowbrook Springs before leaving for college and military service, returning only recently to take over his father's construction business after the elder Ashford's retirement. "We'll be starting with the foundation work," Chris explained to the church board during a planning meeting in February 2023. "The building is structurally sound, but we need to address some moisture issues in the basement and check for any settling problems. We'll also be updating the electrical and plumbing systems throughout the building." Margaret Thornton, who attended the meeting despite her declining health, listened with particular interest to discussions about the basement renovation. In her research, she had discovered that the church's original architectural plans from 1938 showed several storage rooms and utility spaces that didn't appear on more recent building diagrams. If evidence of Blackstone's crimes existed within the church building itself, those forgotten spaces would be the most likely hiding places. "Mr. Ashford," Margaret asked during the question period, "will you be accessing all areas of the basement during the renovation?" "I've been researching the church's architectural history, and I believe there may be spaces that have been walled off over the years." Chris consulted his blueprints thoughtfully. "Actually, yes, we've noticed some discrepancies between the original plans and the current layout. There appear to be areas behind the main basement wall that aren't accounted for in recent modifications. We'll definitely be investigating those spaces as part of the structural assessment." The false pastor Ashworth, who had been listening to the discussion with apparent interest, suddenly spoke up. "I think we should focus on essential repairs rather than exploring every old storage closet. We don't want to go over budget on unnecessary investigations." Margaret noticed the sharp tone in the impostor's voice and filed the observation away with hundreds of others she had collected over the years. Why would a pastor object to exploring all areas of his church building? Work began in earnest in April 2023, with Chris Ashford's crew methodically working through the building from basement to steeple. Margaret made a point of visiting the work site daily, using her wheelchair and the excuse of church historical documentation to observe the renovation progress closely. On May 15, 2023, exactly 15 years after Margaret had first discovered Benjamin Ashworth's journal, Chris Ashford made a discovery that would vindicate her decade-and-a-half-long search for truth. "Mrs. Thornton," Chris called out as Margaret arrived for her daily inspection, "I think you're going to want to see this." Chris led Margaret to a section of the basement where his crew had been removing a false wall that had been installed sometime in the 1970s. Behind the wall, they had discovered a small room approximately 10 feet by 12 feet that appeared on the original building plans but had been sealed off and forgotten for decades. "We found something in there," Chris said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard by other church members. "Something that doesn't make sense for a church storage room." Margaret's heart raced as Chris helped her maneuver her wheelchair closer to the hidden chamber. What she saw inside made her gasp in shock and vindication. The small room had been converted into what could only be described as a command center. Filing cabinets lined two walls, while a third wall featured a large corkboard covered with photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance notes. A desk in the center of the room held computer equipment that looked out of place in a church basement, and several boxes of files were stacked neatly in the corners. But it was the photographs on the corkboard that made Margaret's blood run cold. Dozens of pictures showed Benjamin Ashworth and his family going about their daily lives, Ben working in his study, Kate teaching piano lessons, Timothy and Sarah playing in the parsonage yard. The images had obviously been taken without the family's knowledge, some from considerable distances using telephoto lenses. "My God," Margaret whispered, her hands shaking as she took in the full scope of what they had discovered. "It's all here. Everything." Chris carefully wheeled Margaret closer to the desk so she could examine the documents scattered across its surface. What she found confirmed her worst fears and exceeded her most paranoid suspicions about the scope of Blackstone's operation. The papers included detailed dossiers on Benjamin Ashworth and his family, complete with personal history, psychological profiles, and behavioral analysis. There were transcripts of conversations that had obviously been recorded without the family's knowledge, including private discussions between Ben and Kate about their concerns regarding Harrison Blackstone's visit. More disturbing still were the training materials for Blackstone's replacement pastor. The files contained hundreds of pages documenting Benjamin Ashworth's mannerisms, speech patterns, theological positions, personal relationships, and even intimate details about his marriage and children. The level of detail was so comprehensive that an impostor could indeed fool all but the most observant members of the congregation. "Mrs. Thornton," Chris said quietly, "I think we need to call the police immediately." "Yes," Margaret agreed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they had uncovered. "But first, we need to document everything exactly as we found it. This room has been preserved for 15 years, we can't risk having evidence tampered with or destroyed." Chris spent the next hour carefully photographing every document, every photograph, every piece of equipment in the hidden chamber while Margaret dictated detailed descriptions of each discovery. By the time they finished their initial documentation, both were certain they had found the smoking gun that would finally expose Harrison Blackstone's crimes and reveal the truth about what had happened to the Ashworth family. The most heartbreaking discovery came in a filing cabinet marked "Personal Effects." Inside, Margaret and Chris found items that had obviously belonged to the real Ashworth family: Benjamin's seminary graduation ring, Kate's wedding dress carefully preserved in plastic, Timothy's baseball glove, and Sarah's favorite stuffed animal, a threadbare teddy bear named Mr. Buttons that the little girl had carried everywhere. "They kept trophies," Margaret said softly, her voice breaking as she held Sarah's teddy bear. "Like serial killers keeping souvenirs from their victims." But the most damning evidence was contained in a locked file drawer that Chris managed to open using tools from his construction kit. Inside were financial records documenting payments to various individuals involved in the replacement operation, medical records for surgical procedures that had altered the imposter pastor's appearance to better match Benjamin Ashworth, and most shocking of all, video recordings of the real Ashworth family during their final days at Blackstone's estate. The videos were date-stamped from October 14 through October 20, 2008, and they showed the family being held in what appeared to be a luxurious but secure facility. Benjamin could be seen trying to comfort his terrified wife and children, while Kate struggled to maintain her composure for the sake of Timothy and Sarah. In the final video, dated October 20, 2008, the family was seen being escorted from their room by armed guards. Benjamin could be heard promising his children that everything would be all right, while Kate whispered what sounded like a prayer. The video ended abruptly, and there were no further recordings. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, overwhelmed by the horror of what she was witnessing and the vindication of her 15-year quest for truth. "Christopher," she said finally, "we need to contact the FBI immediately. This is evidence of multiple federal crimes, and it's clear that local law enforcement has been compromised." Chris nodded grimly. "Ma'am, there's something else you should know. I recognize some of these faces in the surveillance photos. Some of these men have been seen around town recently, almost like they're keeping watch on the church renovation. They know we're getting close to the truth," Margaret realized with a chill. "We're in danger." As if summoned by her words, footsteps could be heard coming down the basement stairs. Chris quickly moved to block the entrance to the hidden chamber while Margaret tried to conceal the most damning documents they had been examining. "Hello?" called a familiar voice. "Is anyone down here?" It was the false Pastor Ashworth, and his tone carried a note of suspicion that hadn't been there during the morning's casual interactions. "Just finishing up some measurements, Pastor," Chris called back, his voice carefully casual. "Mrs. Thornton wanted to see the progress we're making." The impostor appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his eyes immediately focusing on the opened hidden chamber. For a moment, his carefully maintained facade slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I see you found our old storage room," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "I'd forgotten it was back there." "It's fascinating how much history these old buildings contain," Margaret said sweetly, her librarian's instincts helping her maintain an innocent demeanor despite the damning evidence surrounding them. "I'm sure the Historical Society will be very interested in documenting what we've found." The false pastor's eyes narrowed slightly, and Margaret realized that her comment had been interpreted as the threat she had intended it to be. "Mrs. Thornton," the impostor said slowly, "I think it would be best if you didn't mention this discovery to anyone else just yet. We wouldn't want to start rumors or cause unnecessary excitement in the congregation." "Of course not, Pastor," Margaret replied, her voice dripping with false agreement. "I understand the importance of discretion." But as the impostor turned and walked back upstairs, Margaret caught Chris's eye and mouthed silently, "Call the FBI now." The confrontation in the basement had made it clear that time was running out. The false pastor would undoubtedly contact his handlers immediately, and Margaret and Chris were now in mortal danger. But after 15 years of searching for the truth, they finally had the evidence needed to expose Harrison Blackstone's crimes and bring justice for the Ashworth family. What they didn't know was that their discovery had set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring down one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history, and reveal the ultimate fate of Benjamin, Catherine, Timothy, and Sarah Ashworth. FBI Special Agent Victoria Rose Chamberlain received the encrypted phone call from Christopher Ashford at 3:47 p.m. on May 15, 2023, while working at her desk in the Bureau's Nashville field office. At 36 years old, Victoria had built a reputation as one of the Bureau's most tenacious investigators, specializing in cases involving organized crime and political corruption. She had been quietly building a case against Harrison Blackstone III for the past 3 years, but had lacked the kind of concrete evidence needed to penetrate his carefully constructed network of legal protections. "Agent Chamberlain," Chris said, his voice tight with urgency, "my name is Christopher Ashford. I'm calling from Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, and I've just discovered evidence of multiple murders that I believe are connected to a criminal conspiracy you've been investigating." Victoria sat up straighter in her chair. "Mr. Ashford, I'm going to need you to be more specific. What kind of evidence, and how do you know about my investigation?" "Ma'am, I found a hidden chamber in Cornerstone Baptist Church containing surveillance materials, training documents, and personal effects that appear to belong to the Ashworth family who disappeared in 2008. There are also financial records and video recordings that implicate Harrison Blackstone III in their murders." Victoria's pulse quickened. The Ashworth case had been on her radar for years, one of several suspicious disappearances connected to Blackstone's political activities, but local authorities had closed it as an accidental death and she had been unable to find grounds for federal intervention. "Mr. Ashford, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not touch anything else in that room. Do not allow anyone else to enter the area. Do not discuss this discovery with anyone except myself. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am, but I should tell you that the church's current pastor already knows about the discovery, and his reaction suggests he's involved in the conspiracy. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, who has been investigating this case for 15 years, believes we're in immediate danger. Mrs. Thornton, the retired librarian who has been contacting various law enforcement agencies about the Ashworth case." "Yes, ma'am. She's been documenting evidence of Blackstone's crimes for over a decade, and everything we found today confirms her theories." Victoria made a quick decision. "Mr. Ashford, I'm dispatching a federal tactical team to your location immediately. Is there a secure location where you and Mrs. Thornton can wait until we arrive? We're in the church basement now, but I don't think we should stay here much longer. The pastor went upstairs about an hour ago, and we haven't seen him since. Get out of that building now, Victoria ordered. Take Mrs. Thornton and go directly to the Willowbrook Springs Police Department. Tell them you're under federal protection and wait for my team to arrive. Do not return to the church under any circumstances. Within minutes, Victoria had assembled a joint task force including FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officers. By 6:30 p.m., federal vehicles were racing toward Willowbrook Springs with warrants to search Cornerstone Baptist Church and arrest Harrison Blackstone III and his known associates. But when the federal convoy arrived at the church, they found the building empty except for Christopher Ashford's construction equipment and the hidden chamber that had been carefully sealed with plastic sheeting to preserve evidence. The false pastor Ashworth had vanished, along with several key documents that Chris and Margaret remembered seeing earlier in the day. They've sanitized the most incriminating materials, Victoria observed as she surveyed the hidden chamber with her team. But they left enough behind to confirm everything we suspected about Blackstone's operation. Dr. Patricia Sinclair, Margaret Thornton's longtime collaborator, had driven down from North Carolina at Victoria's request to assist with the evidence analysis. At 71 years old, she moved slowly but her mind remained sharp as she examined the remaining documents and video recordings. This is extraordinary, Dr. Sinclair told Victoria as they reviewed the surveillance materials. The level of detail in these files represents years of preparation. Blackstone didn't just murder the Ashworth family, he systematically studied them to create the perfect replacement. The video recordings proved to be the most damning evidence. Enhanced digital analysis revealed that the Ashworth family had been held at a facility that FBI records showed was owned by one of Blackstone's shell companies. More importantly, the timestamps on the videos corresponded exactly with cell phone location data that placed several of Blackstone's known associates in the area during the relevant dates. We have them, Victoria told her team as they worked through the night to process the evidence. The videos alone are enough for murder charges, and the financial records connect the operation directly to Blackstone's business empire. But Harrison Blackstone III proved more elusive than his subordinates. When federal agents raided his Nashville mansion at dawn on May 16, they found the estate empty except for a handful of domestic staff who claimed ignorance of their employer's whereabouts. Blackstone's private jet had departed from Nashville International Airport 12 hours earlier, bound for a private airfield in the Cayman Islands. He had an escape plan, Victoria realized as she coordinated with international law enforcement agencies. Someone warned him that we were closing in. The false pastor Ashworth was captured 3 days later at a truck stop in Alabama, attempting to flee the country using forged documents. His real name was revealed to be Marcus Thompson Webb, a former actor and convicted con artist who had undergone extensive plastic surgery to resemble Benjamin Ashworth. Under interrogation, Webb provided crucial testimony about the scope of Blackstone's operation. There were dozens of us, Webb confessed during his first interview with federal prosecutors. Blackstone recruited men who physically resembled his targets, then spent months training us to impersonate specific individuals. The religious leaders were just part of a larger operation that included politicians, business executives, and community leaders throughout the southeastern United States. Webb's testimony revealed that the real Benjamin Ashworth and his family had been murdered on October 20, 2008, exactly as Margaret Thornton had suspected. Their bodies had been disposed of in an abandoned coal mine in eastern Kentucky, a location that Webb provided in exchange for a plea agreement that would spare him from the death penalty. On June 3, 2023, federal investigators discovered the remains of Benjamin, Catherine, Timothy, and Sarah Ashworth in the location Webb had described. Dental records and DNA analysis confirmed their identities, finally providing definitive proof of what Margaret Thornton had suspected for 15 years. The discovery of the Ashworth family's remains triggered a massive federal investigation that ultimately exposed one of the largest identity theft and political manipulation schemes in American history. Over the next 18 months, federal agents arrested more than 40 individuals connected to Blackstone's operation, including politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders who had been complicit in the conspiracy. Harrison Blackstone III was finally apprehended in December 2023 at a private villa in Costa Rica, where he had been living under an assumed identity. His extradition to the United States triggered international headlines and a legal proceeding that would last for years. The trial of Harrison Blackstone III and his co-conspirators began in federal court in Nashville in September 2024. Margaret Thornton, despite her advanced age and declining health, insisted on testifying about her decade-and-a-half investigation that had ultimately exposed the conspiracy. Mrs. Thornton, the federal prosecutor asked during her testimony, "What motivated you to continue investigating this case for so many years when law enforcement agencies dismissed your concerns?" Margaret, sitting in her wheelchair but speaking with clear, strong voice, replied, "Because I knew Benjamin Ashworth, and I knew that the man who replaced him was an impostor. More importantly, I knew that God sees everything, even what is hidden in darkness. Truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how long it takes." Her testimony proved to be one of the most powerful moments in the trial, as she methodically presented 15 years of evidence that had initially been dismissed as the fantasies of an elderly woman but had ultimately proven to be devastatingly accurate. Christopher Ashford also testified about the discovery of the hidden chamber, describing how the renovation of Cornerstone Baptist Church had revealed the truth that had been concealed for 15 years. "It felt like divine providence," Chris told the court. "Of all the contractors who could have been hired for that renovation, it was my company that found that room. Of all the days we could have opened that wall, it happened to be the day Mrs. Thornton was there to witness it. Some might call it coincidence, but I believe God has His own timing for justice." On March 15, 2025, Harrison Blackstone III was convicted on 37 federal charges, including multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, wire fraud, and violation of civil rights. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection, though appeals would likely keep him on death row for years to come. The false pastor Ashworth, Marcus Webb, received life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators. His testimony had been crucial in convicting not only Blackstone but dozens of other co-conspirators who had participated in the identity theft scheme. The real tragedy, of course, was that justice had come too late for Benjamin, Catherine, Timothy, and Sarah Ashworth. But their story had a final chapter that would honor their memory and vindicate the faith that had sustained them even in their darkest hours. On October 20, 2025, 17 years to the day after their murders, the Ashworth family was finally laid to rest in Willowbrook Springs Cemetery. The funeral service, held at Cornerstone Baptist Church, drew more than 1,000 mourners from across the country who had been touched by the family's story and Margaret Thornton's relentless search for truth. Margaret Thornton, now 84 and confined to a wheelchair, delivered the primary eulogy with a voice that carried the authority of someone who had devoted her life to seeking justice. Benjamin Ashworth was a man of God who refused to compromise his principles even when threatened with death, she told the assembled congregation. Catherine was a woman of faith who supported her husband's ministry and loved her children with a mother's fierce devotion. Timothy and Sarah were innocent children whose lives were cut short by evil men, but whose memory has inspired a community to never stop seeking truth. She paused, looking out over the congregation that filled every pew and spilled into the aisles. "For 15 years, I searched for the truth about what happened to this family. Many people thought I was a crazy old woman chasing conspiracy theories. But I knew that God sees everything, even what is hidden in the darkest chambers. And I knew that someday, somehow, justice would be served." The service concluded with the reading of a letter that Benjamin Ashworth had written to his congregation during his final days at Blackstone's estate, a letter that had been discovered among the evidence in the hidden chamber. "My beloved brothers and sisters at Cornerstone Baptist Church," the letter read, "if you are hearing these words, it means that Kate, Timothy, Sarah, and I are no longer with you. I want you to know that we faced our fate without fear, because we knew that God is sovereign even over death. Do not mourn for us, but continue the work of the gospel that we began together. Love one another as Christ has loved you, and never compromise your integrity for worldly gain." We will see you again in glory, where truth reigns eternal and justice is perfect. Until then, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Your pastor and friend, Benjamin Theodore Ashworth. The congregation wept openly as the letter was read, but their tears were mixed with gratitude that the truth had finally been revealed and justice had been served. Christopher Ashford, who had been instrumental in discovering the evidence that exposed Blackstone's crimes, was subsequently called to serve as the new pastor of Cornerstone Baptist Church. His first sermon, delivered on November 1, 2025, was titled "Truth Hidden in Darkness Will Come to Light," and it drew on the lessons learned from the Ashworth family's tragedy. The evil that befell Pastor Ashworth and his family was real and terrible. Chris preached from the same pulpit where Benjamin had delivered his final sermon 17 years earlier. But their story teaches us that truth cannot be buried forever, no matter how powerful the forces that seek to conceal it. God sees everything, and in his perfect timing, he brings justice and reveals what has been hidden. Margaret Thornton lived to see the completion of the legal proceedings against Harrison Blackstone and his associates. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on December 15, 2025, exactly 17 years and 2 months after the Ashworth family's disappearance. Her final journal entry, discovered after her death, read simply, "The truth has been revealed. Justice has been served. My work here is done. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." The hidden chamber beneath Cornerstone Baptist Church was preserved as a memorial to the Ashworth family and a reminder that evil cannot triumph permanently over truth. A plaque installed at the entrance reads, "In memory of Benjamin, Catherine, Timothy, and Sarah Ashworth, whose faith overcame fear and whose truth conquered deception. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." Luke 8 verse 17-inch. Today, Cornerstone Baptist Church thrives under Pastor Christopher Ashford's leadership, with a congregation that has grown to over 1,000 members. The church's ministry includes a foundation dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and a legal aid clinic that helps victims of identity theft and financial fraud. The story of the Ashworth family's disappearance and the 15-year quest for truth that followed has been documented in books, television programs, and court records that will preserve their memory for generations to come. But perhaps the most important legacy of their tragedy is the reminder that truth has its own power, and that those who seek justice with persistence and faith will ultimately see God's righteousness prevail. Harrison Blackstone III remains on death row, his vast criminal empire dismantled and his political influence destroyed. The dozens of co-conspirators who participated in his schemes are serving lengthy prison sentences, their own lives destroyed by their participation in evil. Marcus Webb, the man who stole Benjamin Ashworth's identity and deceived a congregation for 15 years, spends his days in federal prison, reportedly tormented by nightmares about the family whose lives he helped destroy. Guards report that he frequently requests visits from chaplains, seeking forgiveness for crimes that haunt his conscience. But the real victory belongs to those who never stopped believing in truth: Margaret Thornton, who devoted 15 years of her life to seeking justice, Christopher Ashford, who recognized the significance of what he discovered, and countless others who supported the investigation and refused to let the Ashworth family be forgotten. Their story stands as a testament to the power of faith, the importance of persistence in seeking truth, and the certainty that God's justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. In a world where evil often seems to triumph, the vindication of the Ashworth family reminds us that truth will always find a way to emerge from the darkness, and that those who trust in the Lord will never be put to shame. The hidden chamber that concealed the evidence of their murder has been transformed into a chapel where visitors can pray and reflect on the sovereignty of God over human affairs. Above the altar, a simple wooden cross bears the inscription, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid?" Psalm 27 verse 1. It was Benjamin Ashworth's favorite verse, and it sustained his family even in their darkest hour. Today, it continues to inspire all who hear their story and trust in the God who sees all, knows all, and ensures that truth will always triumph over deception, light over darkness, and justice over oppression. The Ashworth family's story had ended in tragedy, but their legacy lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to let evil have the final word. Their faith conquered fear, their truth conquered deception, and their memory continues to bring light to a world that sometimes seems overwhelmed by darkness. In Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, their names are remembered not as victims, but as victors who trusted God even unto death and whose faithfulness ultimately brought justice and peace to their beloved community. Their story reminds us all that no matter how powerful the forces of evil may seem, God's truth will always prevail, and His justice will never be denied.